While international mediators continue to hammer out a new hostage and ceasefire deal between Israel and Hamas, it is unclear how close a deal is to being finalized. According to U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, they are very close.
I think based on what I've seen, 90% is agreed. But there are a few critical issues that remain where we need to be able to get agreement. And they really go to how certain aspects of the agreement would be implemented.
That was Secretary Blinken speaking to reporters during a press briefing yesterday in Haiti. But Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu seems to feel differently.
Hamas is not there with a deal. There's not a deal in the making, unfortunately.
And it's
that still hasn't happened. They want to reconstitute their terror kingdom, and unfortunately it's not close. But we'll do everything we can to get them to the point where they do make a deal.
And that was Prime Minister Netanyahu yesterday on Fox and Friends. So, are we close or not? Joining me now to discuss it and the latest news in the Middle East is geopolitical commentator Erick Stakelbeck, who has spent nearly 2 decades covering the Middle East and national security issues in depth. He's host of the Israel and Middle East-focused newscast, The Watchman, and he's the author of 3 best-selling books, including ISIS Exposed. Erick, welcome back to Washington Watch.
Joseph, great to be with you.
Well, it's good to see you. You saw kind of those competing narratives from Secretary Blinken and what Benjamin Netanyahu had to say. Are we close or are we not?
I don't think we are. And I think that's solely at the feet, Joseph, of Hamas. Look, butchering 6 hostages in cold blood just last weekend. Hamas wants to see a broader war here. On one hand, look, they've been pressured nearly into oblivion, Joseph. The IDF has largely crushed Hamas's capabilities, and yet Hamas wants to live to fight another day. And that means the Iranian regime. That means Hezbollah. That means that entire ring of fire that really surrounds Israel on all sides getting involved to essentially bail Hamas out. So Hamas has been begging its partners in this jihadi coalition over the past several months to get involved, to increase their attacks against Israel. That hasn't quite happened. It has to a degree, but not to the degree Hamas wants, because Iran and Hezbollah know that if they throw their hats in the ring in a major way and it attack Israel in a very significant way, then Israel will very likely unleash hell on them. So Hamas is in a very difficult position, but we still have, say, the Biden administration and the European Union asking essentially nothing of Hamas, Joseph, but everything from Israel. It's all up to Israel to make concessions, not Hamas, apparently, in order to get some sort of deal done.
Well, this does seem like something of a zero-sum game, because for a long time, Israel has been told to make peace with Hamas, but Hamas does not want Israel to exist. And Israel has now adopted the same position. We're supposed to negotiate with Hamas, but Israel has decided Hamas should no longer exist. So it's hard to see how a negotiation comes out of that. But Erick, it's interesting. We know the long-standing relationship between Israel and the United States. Yet, as we saw in those clips, the positions, the statements that are coming out of those 2 nations are very different right now. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, I think the Biden administration, number one, is facing an election right now. At least Kamala Harris, the vice president, is. And they see this, Joseph, as a distraction. Any sort of foreign policy or national security crisis abroad is a distraction for them right now. They are focused on, in their words, fundamentally transforming America. So Israel continuing to defend itself against bloodthirsty terrorists, that's a nuisance for them. That's why they want to see this. And Joe Biden has made this clear. Kamala Harris has made this clear. They want to see this war go away. The problem with that is if Israel agrees to a premature ceasefire, that will enable Hamas to regroup, to rearm, and to carry out, God forbid, more October 7th style attacks. That's why Israel has literally stuck to its guns and saying, look, we're not going to give up, say, the Philadelphia corridor. Now, that's that crucial transit point, Joseph, along the Gaza-Egypt border, and that is the main route through which Hamas has used to rearm. Israel says, we need to shut that down. The Biden administration, on the other hand, just says, look, we want peace at any cost. Well, that's not good for Israel. And Israel, just like America should, Israel should put its own security first, and that's exactly what they're doing.
Yeah. You mentioned there that the Biden administration just wants this war to go away, and on some level, everyone does. But as a political matter, and you indicated there that there is an election, and that's always relevant because everything is happening in a political context. But is it a good look for the Biden administration to come out and say, "Hey, we're 90% of the way there," when their closest ally and the people most interested in it are saying, "No, we're not"? Is that just communicating like just detachment, indifference, unawareness?
Yeah, Joseph, great point. I would say daylight, right? Daylight between the United States and Israel. And we don't want to see that because, key point here, the same radical terrorist forces that want to destroy Israel also have a bullseye on the back of America. Israel's enemies and America's enemies are one in the same. It seems sometimes in D.C. these days, they're forgetting that. I'll give you a great example. The day after, again, 6 hostages, including an American citizen, were butchered in cold blood by Hamas. Joe Biden's first impulse was to criticize Benjamin Netanyahu and say Netanyahu's not doing enough to get the deal done. Instead of castigating Hamas, he's laying the blame, in many cases, at the feet of Israel. And again, on one hand, the Biden administration, Joseph, it's sort of a schizophrenic policy, I've said over the past few months, in that on one hand, the Biden administration is sending Israel military assistance, no doubt, at the same time withholding some arms shipments as well. But on the other side, the Biden administration seems to take every opportunity it can to publicly criticize Israel. And the impression that gives to our shared enemies is, hey, wait a minute, they're not on the same page. There's vulnerability there. Perhaps Israel is ripe for the picking. The U.S. doesn't quite have their back the way they used to. Maybe Israel is a softer target. So the perception of daylight between the United States and Israel is not only dangerous for Israel, it's dangerous for America.
And you state there that the enemies of Israel are the enemies of America. So it's in our best interest to defeat them now and show strength and behave in a way that would deter future action. Now, that makes sense if you believe the enemies of Israel are also the enemies of the United States. Do you believe the Biden administration believes that?
I think the Biden administration believes that they can be these shared enemies we're discussing, and we're talking Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis in Yemen, for instance, Joseph. The Biden administration believes they can be contained. Well, we're approaching the anniversary of 9/11, and I think that showed that in many cases with Islamic jihadists who are bent on literally global domination, containment doesn't always work. The Biden administration sees, say, an Iranian nuclear program as a more local, regional problem for Israel. To answer your question, I guess the broader view, Joseph, is they know, the Biden administration, that Iran, Hamas, et cetera, don't like the United States, but they think, number one, that they're contained, and number two, that, again, it's more of a regional problem. Hey, tough break for Israel. That's your backyard, but we're safe here. We're separated by oceans. Well, I'll tell you what, our own Pentagon, Joseph, says that the Iranian regime is currently working on intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs. Now, those ICBMs aren't for Israel. They're not even for Europe. They're for the nation that Iran calls the Great Satan. That's us, the United States. And that's not a coincidence. The ultimate goal, again, is America. If they were to get their grand wish, and we know it's not going to happen because we've read the book, but if Israel were to be wiped off the map, they're not going to pack up their bags and go home. They're coming here next. Their ideology demands it, and they're very open and very vocal about it.
Yeah. Well, of course, Israel is living and responding in a geopolitical environment, but ultimately Benjamin Netanyahu is responsible to the people who elected him and the citizens of Israel. What's the position of the public in Israel in this conflict? Are they supportive of Netanyahu or not?
Yeah, I think it's split. I think there's still very strong support for Bibi, Joseph, no doubt. That is still there. But there is essentially a strong left-wing presence that is very opposed to Bibi. They were before October 7th, by the way. We had for a year before October 7th, massive anti-government protests driven by the Israeli left. So there's still a large segment of the population that's very supportive of Netanyahu, but there's also a substantial pocket that's saying, look, we want new elections. we want him out. We saw major demonstrations last weekend in Tel Aviv, which is kind of the left wing. Tel Aviv's a beautiful city, but it's definitely a hub for the left in Israel, no doubt. So major demonstrations there last weekend. But Bibi's still standing. He's still there. And look, I think in terms of sticking to his guns, especially on this ceasefire, he's doing a good job. And remember, Rafah, where the 6 hostages were murdered last weekend, where another hostage, thankfully, was rescued about 10 days ago, the Biden administration, Biden and Harris, both publicly said Israel should not go into Rafah. They wailed and gnashed their teeth for months and tied Israel's hands and said, don't you dare go into Rafah. Well, guess what? Israel went into Rafah, which is right along that Egypt border that we discussed a minute ago, and they destroyed Hamas there, and they rescued hostages. So seemed to be a bad tactical piece of advice by the Biden administration. But Bibi stuck to his guns, and he did go into Rafah, and he's not caving to a premature ceasefire that would leave Israel vulnerable once again.
Yeah. When it is your life on the line and your family's life on the line, I think you do respond differently to calls for, a ceasefire than if you are not in the neighborhood and you and your family are not on the line. And that could explain a lot of what we're dealing with. Erick Stakelbeck, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Joseph. God bless.